Hello, everybody. We're going to finish up our lesson here on conditionals. Last week, we had the opportunity to look at the zero and the first conditional. And in this lesson here, we're going to look at the second and third conditional, as well as restrictive and mixed conditionals. So, in last week's class, we started by looking at this overview chart of the different types of conditionals. As you can see here, according to the type, we have six different types of conditionals, and each one of these conditionals comes with their own form. Different way that you will form the if clause and the result clause in respect to verb tenses. And then each one of the conditionals has its own meaning. Two of them, type 0 and type 1, are real conditionals, meaning that the likeliness of the result clause and the conditional clause occurring is very high, whereas the type 2 and 3 conditionals, those are known as unreal conditionals. And unreal conditionals are untrue. The if clause and the result clause is not possible. And so those are the different types of meanings through the 0, 1, 2, and 3 types of conditionals. And we'll get a little bit more into restrictive conditionals and mixed conditionals in a bit. Okay. There were a couple of key points that we brought out early on about conditionals and you always want to keep this in mind. They are composed of two clauses. The conditional clause is the subordinate clause, and the conditional clause will be the clause with if, and then you have the result clause. If clauses tend to come at the beginning of the sentence, and when beginning a sentence with a conditional clause, don't forget that you want to place a comma before the subject of the main clause, and that is true for all subordinators, like the words if, when, after, because, even though, in order to, just a few examples of other subordinators. Another key point to bring out now, I think, also is that the 0 and the 1 conditional, the real conditionals, are the more prominently used of all of the conditionals. So those demand a little bit more of your attention. I showed this last week. This is just a graphic representation of the different types of conditionals, how they're broken down, and which verb tenses are used in those conditionals. So you can study this in a little bit more with a little more time by viewing the PowerPoint. Okay. So now just to review on the 0 and the 1 conditionals, when we looked at the 0 conditional, we saw that we had three types of 0 conditionals. Now, the meaning of all the 0 conditionals is the same. It's based on general facts or things where the if and the result clause are very likely to happen. Okay. The three different types of 0 conditionals you can see in this result clause, the third column on the left right here. This will show you the form that you're going to use in each the result and the main clause. So in one of the types of the 0 conditionals, you can see that you will use if plus the present tense, as we see here, and then the imperative you will use to begin the main clause, and the imperative is just the base form of the verb. So this type of conditional you use when you're giving commands or directions or instructions or something along the lines of this nature. Then you have the other type of 0 conditional where you're going to use if plus present again in the if clause, and then you're going to use the present tense in the result clause. And the only difference here is that I have a subject before the verb, and therefore it's not a command. All right, but these types you can use this type here as well. And then you have another type where again you're going to use the present tense, but this time you'll include the modal. So either of these here in the 0, these are used for general statements, instructions, directions that where there is a hypothetical situation involved. Then we have the first real conditional, and the first real conditional refers to the future time. So that said, in your if clause, you still use the present tense. However, in the result clause, you're going to use the future tense. And the likeliness of the result clause happening is very high. As I mentioned last week, I don't like to put numbers on things, but let's say it's 90%. So The key here is to remember from a foreign perspective not to mix the will and the if. So you have to separate those. You can never say if blank will, if I will, if you will. That's not good form. So you want to use if in the conditional clause, and then you want to use will in the result clause, or you can use going to as well. So that is the main difference between the zero and the first. Then we had a couple of key points to keep in mind about the real conditionals. They refer to present or future time. There are four combinations of verb tenses, as I've just presented. I mentioned before that real conditionals occur more frequently than the other types of conditionals. And that zero conditional is for general truths, facts, or instructions, and the one conditional expresses events that are likely to occur, highly likely to occur in the future. Then we went through trying to identify different types of real conditionals. So I'm not going to do this here, but you can go through the PowerPoint and you're basically looking for the conditional clauses in the paragraph, and then to think of what type of a conditional it is. Is it a zero conditional or a first conditional? And then if it is zero, what is it? Is it a present? Is it a modal? Or is it an imperative? So this is a noticing exercise hoping to help you to consolidate the form structures of the real conditional. So I had about 5 of those here. Okay, most of these examples here are taken from the career resources page, and they deal with applying for a job at the UN. Okay, if you want to read these, you can go back and look over the PowerPoint. Then we did do this exercise here, the error correction exercise. I'll briefly review this here. In the first one, the mistake is that there is the use of will in 2 places, and we just saw that that's not correct. And I stated that you do not use will with in the conditional clause. So the mistake with number 1 is that will is being used in the conditional clause. To correct the mistake, simply remove will. Number 2, this is about punctuation. Remember, if you start a sentence with if, you want to put a comma before the subject of the main clause. So there's no comma here. Number 3 deals with imperatives. If you want to give instructions to somebody, if you want to give a command to somebody in a conditional, you don't use a subject. And that's true for whenever you use an imperative. I don't say, you go here, or you do the homework. You just say, do the homework, go here. So make sure that you remove the subject if you're going to give a command. In number 4, this doesn't really deal with conditionals and more with subject-verb agreement, but it pops up with conditionals, so you want to remember there is an S missing here. So when you use a conditional in the present tense, don't forget to put an S on the verb if the subject is third person. And number 5, the mistake is the wrong use of the tenses. I'll talk to you tomorrow. So that's future. So that, and we see the will over here, so then we know that we have to have present time here in the conditional clause, and this is a bad attempt to mix clauses. So those are some errors that could come out when you're using real conditionals, so you just want to make sure that you're aware of those. Okay. Now on to something new, unreal conditionals. And unreal conditionals are conditionals that, like their name states, these are not true. There is no likeliness of these happening. Or you can also use unreal conditionals to talk about the past, and then you're just trying to talk about something that's not true in the past. Maybe you're regretting that you didn't do something. You're trying to talk about something that is counter to either the present or past reality. And that's useful in some ways. But as, like I said, 0 and 1 are more common, so the 2 and 3 are not more of the common types. And when they are used, they're used more in conversation, I would venture to say, rather than in the written genre. So when we take a look at this here, we have the if clause is a little bit different with 2 and 3, because a lot of times when you use 2 and 3, you can have what's called an implied clause. An implied clause means that the condition is not explicitly stated. There's no word if being used. However, you know that there is an implied condition or a suggested condition. So if you sometimes see would or would have, and you're not really understanding the meaning, think to yourself that there might be an implied condition here. So we can see in the first example, number two, the special representative emphasized that a siege of 750,000 people would have enormous implications and that 90% of efforts to break a siege fail. Excuse the period here. That should be there shouldn't be any punctuation here, so just let me clarify that. But what we can see here in the if clause is that there is no word if, and it's just implied. That's why when we read the result clause, we see the word would. So would, we use would when we talk about the second type of conditional. And so if you, like I said, if you see would and you're not really understanding it, there might be an implied condition here. And think about it. What is the implied condition? So when we look back at the if clause, the implied condition, try to restate it using the word if, right? So we can say that if there were a siege of 750,000 people, it would have enormous implications. Okay, so they're not saying that a siege happened. They're saying if it happened. But they're saying it in an implied way. They're not stating it explicitly. Number two, this example here is more clear because it's explicitly stated the condition. If you were in New York, I would give you a tour of the UN. Notice the use of were right here. Okay. What and you can this will bring out one part of the form for the second type, the second conditional. In the second conditional, in the if clause, you are going to use the simple past tense. Okay, so you use if plus the simple past when it's explicitly stated, and then in the result clause you use would and the base form of the verb. So or some people they call it present, but it's really known as the base form. So you use the past with would plus the present. What you are doing here is that you are talking about something that is not true in the present time. If you were in New York, you are not in New York right now, so it's not true now. So the condition is not true, and the result is not true. And so the result would be I would give you a tour of the UN. So both of these are untrue. You are not in New York, therefore I cannot give you a tour of the UN. However, just because it's untrue doesn't mean we can't talk and speculate about it. And that's what you use the second conditional for, to talk about things that are not true in the present tense. The condition is not true, the result is not true. So again, you use the if plus the simple past and would plus the base form. Or at times there won't be an if statement and it will be implied. When we look at the third conditional is probably the trickiest just because the form takes a lot of concentration to consolidate. But what you're talking about when you use the third conditional is something in the past that's not true. Okay, so with the first example in number two, when we looked at that, we saw that, or the second example actually, when we looked at if you were in New York, well, you're not in New York now. That's not true now. When we look at examples for number three, we're saying that this is not true in the past. Okay, so the first example, this was taken from when Malala came and spoke at the UN. Okay, and she was talking about when she was shot by the Taliban. So she says, I do not even hate the Talib who shot me. If there had been a gun in my hand, I would not have shot him. So she's talking about the past. She's talking about something that's not true in the past, that she had a gun. She did not have a gun, but she's saying, if I did have a gun. So and then she's saying, what is the condition or the result that would take place if I did have a gun? And she's saying, I would not have shot him. So both the if clause, the conditional clause, and the result clause are not true, and they both refer to past times. Here, the second example for type 3 is an implied condition because we don't see the if word, and in this case, without takes the place of if. So without his personal involvement, without his passion for bringing up the issue to the highest political levels, this is in regards to Ban Ki-moon, I don't think we would have had the Paris Agreement. So let's try to put that in other words using if. If Ban Ki-moon was not personally involved, or if Ban Ki-moon had not been personally involved, if Ban Ki-moon did not have passion for bringing up the issue to the highest level, we would not have had the Paris Agreement. So that's another way of saying it using if. If we focus on the form for the third conditional, you can see here that we use the past perfect in the if clause, and then we use would have plus the past participle in the result clause. So once again, we use the past perfect in the if clause, and we use would have plus past participle in the result clause. And that's why it's a little bit difficult, because there's a lot of auxiliaries involved, the use of past participles. So again, the difference between 2 and 3 is that 2 refers to the present time, 3 refers to the past time. That's the difference. The similarity is that they both talk about things that are not true. Okay, if you want to get a review of the form, then you want to come back. I'm just going to scroll back here. You have this here as a short or a brief reminder, right? Second conditional uses simple past plus would in the base form. The third conditional uses past perfect plus would have, and in both cases you're going to use past participles. You can also refer to this chart over here, where you can get a review of the meaning and the function. Okay? So there's your second conditional and your third conditional, again untrue in the present and in the past, and here's their functions. Okay, so that's the second and the third conditional. I'm going to just go back to the point where I was at. Okay, and now we'll just look at some more examples. They're already highlighted here. This is one that we had already seen. If there had been a gun in my hand, I would not have shot him. That's an example of a third conditional talking about things that are untrue in the past. Here's the other example that I had brought out in that form right there. Let's take a look at another one here. This is the one about Ban Ki-moon. Again, implied condition using without instead of if. So again, if you see would have plus past participle, or would plus a base form, and there's no if, you have to think that the condition is implied, and then start thinking what is the implied condition and try to rephrase it in your own words using if. Here's another example here. So again, take the PowerPoint, take some time, look over the examples, pay particular attention to the form, and then also don't think about the meaning. Okay. Then we have what are called restrictive conditionals, and restrictive conditionals put a restriction on the condition. All right. So a couple of words that we use to make restrictive conditionals, or a couple of phrases, are only if, even if, unless, and otherwise. Okay. So two of these are negative, unless and otherwise. And then we have some that are a little bit, they're positively restricted. So when we use only if, what we're saying with only if is that there is only one condition that can bring about this result. Okay, so when we look at the main clause over here, this can be done immediately. Okay, but there's a condition, and there's only one condition that can help us to do this immediately. And that condition is only if the parties live up to the resolution. In other words, if the parties do not live up to the resolution, then this cannot be done, because there is only one condition that can bring about the result. When we use even if, we're trying to make an emphasis here. We're trying to emphasize that there is nothing that can happen that can bring about this result. When we use only if, we're saying only one condition can bring this result. When we use even if, we're saying no condition can bring this result. And the reason we use even if is to emphasize this, right? So it might be, you can even use it to express some kind of an amount of surprise, right? or something unexpected. So I would not have shot him even if I had a gun in my hand. So you expect you've been shot, you have a gun in your hand, you're going to shoot back. But Malala is saying, no, I would not have done that. So again, with even if, we're saying there is no condition that can bring about the result. The risk of disease in water increases if it is transported, even if it was collected from a clean source. So there's really nothing that can stop water from running the risk of having a disease, even if you get it from a clean source. Not even a clean source will protect this water in transport. Okay, so again, to emphasize, to state there is no condition that can bring about the result. Unless is a little bit easier, or not easier, I should say, it's just a little bit different, because when we use unless, what we're really saying is if not. So anything that has unless is a negative condition. And you can simply just replace unless with the words if not. So in the example here, it is almost certain to explode unless movement and access restrictions are lifted. So in other words, if movement and restrictions are not lifted, it is almost certain to explode. So again, I take the unless, I put if, and then I make it negative. So if movement and access restrictions are not lifted, it's saying the exact same thing. Okay. With otherwise, that is also like saying if not, but whereas unless is a subordinator and we use it in a dependent clause, otherwise is a connector and we use it to connect to independent clauses, if you remember back from our lesson on sentence boundaries. So again, it serves the place of if not, just like unless, but we use it at the beginning of a sentence, so it's punctuated differently. So they must be protected and exported legally under the authority of the Presidency Council. Otherwise, its citizens will pay the price. So the other difference here is that the negation, it really refers to the main clause, right? So I'm going to say if they if they are not protected and exported legally under the authority of the Presidency Council, its citizens will pay the price. So the difference with unless and otherwise, even though they both mean if not, if I try to substitute if not with unless, I substitute the if not in the conditional clause. If I try to substitute if not for otherwise, I don't substitute it in the same clause. I put the if not in the main clause. Okay, so we have only if one condition brings the result, even if no condition brings the result, and then unless and otherwise, which means the same thing as if not. It's a way to negate a conditional clause. Okay, so those are your restrictive clauses, and then you have some examples here. Okay. I'm calling them restrictive clauses, but really restrictive conditionals. I don't, in case you know the term restrictive clauses from your study of relative or adjective clauses, I don't want you to confuse it with that. So I just made the term restrictive clause here for restrictive conditionals. Then you have finally your mixed conditionals, and your mixed conditionals is where you mix verb tenses, right? You mix the conditionals. So you might have a conditional that refers to the present time, but the result refers to the future time or the past time. So these are different ways of having conditional sentences and then mixing the two types of clauses on time. Not as common as the other types of conditionals, but worth noting. So you can see here these examples are taken from both the resources page and the career human resources page. So you have here in the if clause, this is about somebody applying for a job. If you were in the group of candidates recommended for the job opening, meaning in the past, then you will be placed on the roster for similar functions in the future. All right, so the condition occurred in the past, but the result will occur in the future. So in that way, we mix the conditionals here to allow us to speak about both times. So this is just one example of a mixed conditional. Another example, if you have been informed of your inclusion in the roster in the past, but it's at a non-specific time, therefore the use of the present perfect, you can potentially be selected. This uses simple present, and it refers to either present or future time. So we mix again something in the past at a non-specific time with something in the present or the future. Third example, if I help people get from point A to point B, I am making a contribution. Not the best example. It does mix tenses. We have the simple present in the condition. We have the present progressive in the result clause. One reason why I say it's not that special is because we can just say, I make a contribution. We could put that in the simple present too. However, maybe it provides a little bit more emphasis and immediacy by using the progressive. And then we have one that mixes the past perfect with the simple past. So again, mixing something in the past with something in the present or future. As for the employment verification, if you had indicated in your application that you have objections to contacting your current employer, this employer is not contacted until you have actually been selected for and you have confirmed your interest in the position. So again, mixing something from the past with something from the future. So we use three different tenses here to mix something in the past. So the combination tends to be past with future, but maybe different verb tenses in the past depending on how you want to specify that time. Is it a specific moment? Use the simple past. Is it completed but non-specific? Use the present perfect. If it is completed and happens before another event, then you want to use the past perfect. So those are your mixed conditionals. Okay, and then you have your examples for those as well. Take the time to go over those. Okay, so that brings us to the final part, which is to talk about wishes, because wishes is also speaking about hypothetical conditions, things that do not exist, things that you wish and hope for. There are three types of wish statements that you can make, ones that refer to the past, ones that refer to the present, and ones that refer to the future. And of course, all of those have different forms, right? But they're all about wishes. They're all about things that are untrue. So there's not really that much in the meaning to go into. It's basically looking at the form. So one of the tricky things about wishes is if you want to wish for something in the present, so you don't have something now, you want it now, then you're going to use the past tense in order to say that. So here, this is taken from the UN News Center. This is from a news article on the UN. Let me go back to that page. Sorry about that. So the person says, I wish I had good news. They don't mean about the past. They mean about right now, even though they use the simple past tense. So that's what's a little bit confusing. So I wish I had $1 million right now, but I used had, right? That's the trick. I wish, I wish it, I wish you were here. That's a very common phrase used with the wish. I wish you were here. Not in the past. I wish you were here right now. So don't forget when you want to make a wish statement about the present time, you must use the past tense. Okay? If you want to make a wish about something in the past, then you're going to use the wish plus perfect tense. Wish plus the past perfect, or wish plus the modal and the perfect form. So I wish that things had been different for me in the past, or last year, or when I was growing up, for example. I deeply regret the loss of life and suffering. I wish it could have been avoided in the past. But notice here, because we use the modal, the form's a little bit different. Don't think this is present perfect. It's just modal with the perfect form. Okay? So you have the two ways here, depending on if you're using a modal, plus have and the past participle. And if you're not using a modal, then you just want to use the past perfect. And then if you want to talk about wish in the future, you're going to use wish plus would. So I wish the UN would start a campaign in collaboration with all the countries to stand for unity against this radical racism. I wish the UN would enforce these laws in the future. So there is the summary of the three types of wish statements, referring to the present, past, and the future, and then the forms that you have to use after wish in order to make that temporal relationship clear. And then your examples for wishes follow. And that brings us to the close of the lesson on restrictive conditionals, mixed conditionals, and wishes, which form the second part of the lesson on the topic of conditionals. Take the time to review the PowerPoint, study the examples, and if you have any questions or seeking clarity about any of the topics in this short video, please feel free to email me and begin a dialogue. Thank you all.